Egypt has one of the longest-lasting cultures on Earth, over 7,000 years. Its ancient civilization still fascinates us today, with its dramatic pyramids, its monumental sculptures, and its tombs, with their unusual hieroglyphs. We borrow from ancient Egypt all the time, to give grace and power to modern buildings, even to enhance our wardrobes. Some people have, like the pharaohs, built their own pyramids. This Egyptian-style mausoleum is in the Homewood Cemetery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When we think of ancient Egypt, we think of mummies, preserved for thousands of years. They are silent reminders of real people who lived and died long ago. But mummies have been misunderstood. Weird, often outrageous myths, like the curse of the mummy, have risen from the sands of ancient Egypt to be propagated by Hollywood movie makers. Museums have a responsibility to replace those myths with historical facts. In Pittsburgh, the people at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History have taken a fresh look at their ancient Egyptian collection. They have carefully conserved many of these treasures and added to the information that is known about them. They've even built a wonderful new space for the collection. Now it's time for us all to take a fresh look at these mummies, tombs, and various pieces of ancient Egypt. These colossal statues announce the entrance to the Carnegie's Walton Hall of Ancient Egypt. There's a story behind these statues. We'll tell you that later. Inside the Walton Hall are mummies, a recreation of a tomb, and hundreds of pieces of ancient Egypt, as well as a huge boat that may have been used as part of an ancient Egyptian funeral rite. Before the Carnegie opened the doors to this hall, 7 years of research and building took place. First, they studied, cleaned, and repaired each of the 604 objects on display. Egypt sits in the north of Africa, surrounding the mighty Nile River. The hot, dry climate of Egypt was ideal for preserving the most fragile organic material. Pittsburgh's climate was not. Over the years, moisture and temperature changes caused the Carnegie's Egypt artifacts to deteriorate. Paint started to flake from coffin lids. Salts cracked the surfaces of pottery and stone. Bronze disease damaged delicate statues. In 1983, the Carnegie received a grant to preserve its Egyptian treasures. David Waters, Associate Curator of Anthropology and Project Co-Director for the Egypt Hall, thinks preservation of these artifacts is crucial.
If we lose anthropological material, you're not going to have ancient Egyptians making any more material. We may find more material that was made in the past, but there's not going to be any more material made. But we're dealing with something that really is endangered species, if you want to look at it from that perspective.
Pittsburgh also had the worst air pollution in the world for nearly a century. The same destructive grime that stained the museum outside coated its Egypt exhibit inside, even falling on coffins housed in glass cases.
This is really cleaning up beautifully. Just look at that, just coming right up. Doesn't that look good?
Joan Gardner is the conservator for the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. She and private conservator Tamsin Fuller use the latest techniques to clean these priceless objects.
I would say most of the collection had to be cleaned because this is Pittsburgh, an industrial city, and over 100 years now these things have been in the storage rooms and or on exhibit. And we didn't filter out the particulates and the soot, so they were in the environment and of course would settle on any object that was left out. So overall our objects, our Egyptian objects, had a sort of graying film on them. That had to be removed as much as we could.
Some of the Carnegie's Egypt artifacts, this coffin lid, for example, were damaged long before coming to the museum.
Was it robbers who?
As far as we know, we have no way of finding out. You know, your guess is as good as mine. Whoever it was did a fine job of hacking it up. Irreparable damage to that, to the face, to the whole side, to the nose.
Damage becomes part of an object's history. So does every repair. Joan and Tamsin don't try to restore an artifact to its original splendor.
I try to use colors that are compatible, that I tone down so that they blend but don't perfectly match, so that anybody will know that that is the repair, and that's as far as she went with that repair. Let something that's ancient look ancient, but look cared for, and that's what we're trying for here.
This coffin was the Carnegie's very first acquisition. Andrew Carnegie purchased it while on a tour of Egypt in 1894. Unfortunately, the mummy that was inside this coffin is too badly damaged to display. It now rests in a modern coffin in museum storage. But other mummified remains are exhibited here. They've been carefully stabilized by museum conservators.
We've got some previous restoration. Can you see the wires here? Somebody has tried to hold it together in the past.
This is the mummy of a full-grown man, dating back to the Roman period in Egypt, between 30 BC and 395 AD. The head has separated from the body.
A hand peeks through the linen wrappings, where robbers tore a hole to steal the jewelry that rested across the chest.
Joan and Tamsin found a way to hold together these fragile, powder-dry remains.
There was no way to restore that, and I certainly wasn't going to attempt any sort of rewrapping process. I don't think I could have done it. It wouldn't have been done correctly. Yeah, we'd use that then probably. And just sort of sew a sleeve around so that we don't attempt in any way to reinsert needles or thread into this old wrappings.
One of the Carnegie's mummies has no wrappings. Known simply as the dead man of Guft, he was buried 6,000 years ago before embalming became common in Egypt.
The desert sands preserved his remains, right down to his hair and his tongue, still visible through his teeth. The first evidence of true mummification dates back to the early part of Dynasty IV, more than 4,000 years ago. Through an incision in the left side of the body, the vital organs were removed. The body was bathed in resins, wine, and oil, and coated with natron, a natural drying agent. A priest intoned prayers as linen strips were wrapped around the body.
But mummification was not a morbid preoccupation with death, according to Egyptologist and project co-director Diana Craig Patch.
The ancient Egyptians didn't like death. They didn't look forward to death. But what they anticipated was eternal life, and that's what they prepared for. The tombs, the mummies, the various types of equipment that were buried in these tombs were all to give the individual in the tomb a chance at an afterlife that was ideal.
Another misconception about ancient Egypt is the myth of the mummy's curse. The idea that these long-dead people could rise up and murder anyone who disturbed their resting place was a notion taken to fantastic heights by Hollywood filmmakers.
So the curse of the mummy is something that is really pretty much out of Hollywood. There are plenty of archaeologists that have worked in Egypt and have excavated both tombs and temples and have not suffered any consequences. The ancient Egyptians did leave inscriptions. They left threats that indicated anyone who damaged a tomb would not have a successful afterlife. However, there were enough Egyptians that apparently really didn't believe that that curse was real, because ancient tomb robbing was very prevalent in certain periods.
But even the bravest tomb robber took precautions. That's why the faces on coffins and statues are often damaged.
The Egyptians actually believed that statues, the spirit inhabited statues and that the statues breathed. By damaging the face area, in particular the nose on statues, that prohibited the individual from living forever, and that way that individual couldn't persecute the tomb robbers that had defiled his burial.
The Egyptians also mummified animals to be used as votive offerings to specific deities. Among the Carnegie's animal mummies, X-rays show a falcon, a fish, a crocodile, and 2 cats. One cat is a fake, which suggests that even in ancient Egypt, the pious were often cheated.
In other words, the priests had not bothered to mummify, and they had just made a package, wrapped it so it looked like it was mummified, and then probably sold it to a local pilgrim who then donated it back to the temple. Therefore, they made money by selling it, but without having to expend any of the efforts or materials to mummify a real animal.
These artifacts have survived for thousands of years, but everything that comes in contact with them, including moisture, dust, and even light, has negative effects. The museum is dedicated to slowing down the aging of these pieces. When the Carnegie built this new Egypt Hall, every case was designed as a sort of tomb to seal out dust and dirt. The hall has its own environmental control system, and some of the cases have mini environments inside of them for objects like this stone stela that need drier surroundings than the rest of the pieces.
In order to do that, the carpenters formed a plexi case within a case, and then they have down here a wooden section. This drawer is where we use silica gel. The little pink chips tell me that it has absorbed all the moisture that it can.
Custom mounts made of inert plexiglass were made to support every object. Even the amount of ultraviolet and incidental light hitting the objects was closely scrutinized. In preserving these artifacts, the museum faced many challenges. Some bordered on just plain strange.
They received a phone call from a woman who requested to be allowed to sleep in one of the Egyptian coffins overnight because she felt she was a descendant of the person who had been in that coffin. That causes a lot of artifact deterioration, so that was not allowed.
But there was a time in the museum when artifacts were not treated so carefully. These are the timbers of a 30-foot Egyptian funerary boat, which stood out in the open in the old Egypt Hall. A photograph of an airline stewardess posing inside this 3,800-year-old treasure made Joan Gardner wince.
I felt real sorry for the boat, but many people have stood in it. It was not uncommon, apparently, for people to put the children inside the boat and take their picture.
The boat has a history of rough handling since its purchase by Andrew Carnegie in the early 1900s. It was hauled to Oakland by horse cart before there was even a museum to put it in.
So it was stored in a shed out back of the old library building until such time as they actually created the new museum.
And then it didn't fit through any of the doors, so they uncrated it and lowered it whole down through the roof, and then built the roof over it.
Then, sometime in 1958, the boat was varnished with a product called wife pride, which, over time, caused the surface of some of the timbers to flake off.
And of course, the people who did it did not realize they would be causing such a problem, or they would never have done it. They thought they were improving the conditions of the boat because it was, as one person said, it was beginning to look kind of bad.
The boat was taken off display in 1979. For 10 years, it lay in pieces in storage, waiting to be studied and reconstructed.
Cheryl Haldane is a nautical archaeologist from Texas A&M University. She was thrilled to be invited to look at these timbers and add to the information about the boat.
This boat is one of the earliest boats in the whole world that we know about. This is the first chance we've had to look and see the edges of the planks so that we can understand how they were putting the boat together. There's a slip of wood, probably shaped like this, although this is a reconstruction of one, that would just fit into a slot and be met by a slot on the opposite plank. And it is only these that hold the boat together. There's not a nail used in the construction of the boat.
Along the edges of these planks, Cheryl found paint marks left by boat builders to show where notches should be cut. She also found a surprising piece of 3,800-year-old rope.
I found cordage.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you...
This is exciting.
Oh,
real
wonderful.
cordage. Look.
Real cordage.
When it was time to reassemble the boat inside the new Egypt Hall, members of the Carnegie staff grew to appreciate the ancient shipwrights who first constructed this craft.
Together, I think it weighs around 2,100 pounds. It's a little over a ton. It's a remarkable piece of work, and it just went together so beautifully. It was just no trouble at all putting that boat together. The craftsmen who built it were wonderful.
A headline once called this the yacht of an ancient king, but it was not built for recreation. It was most likely built for a pharaoh's burial. Remnants of pigment still clinging to these planks suggest that the boat was once brightly painted. A computer graphic recreation shows what it might have looked like. The Carnegie's boat was found buried near the pyramid complex of Pharaoh Senwosret III, and experts don't think it ever spent much time on the waters of the Nile.
I feel the boat may have been used in the burial ceremony to convey people, equipment from the east bank to the west bank, just across the river, a very short distance.
Or maybe it was just built on the west bank of the Nile, near where it was buried, and then hauled up to the pyramid in a procession.
But because it had been used in a royal ceremony, you couldn't just chop them up and use them somewhere else or throw them away. They were buried in the sand near the complex so they were disposed of correctly.
Most of the pieces of ancient Egypt on display in the Carnegie did not belong to pharaohs or noblemen. They are everyday items that were used by average working-class Egyptians. Mirrors, razors, and tweezers tell us that personal hygiene was important to these people. In the burning desert, hair on the face and head was both uncomfortable and unclean. Men and women wore eye makeup, partly to reduce the sun's glare and partly to enhance beauty. Inside some of these cosmetic jars is a 3,000-year-old residue of coal, the black powder Egyptians mixed with grease or oil and applied around the eye. The oldest pieces in the exhibit, the Neolithic stone tools, date back 7,000 years to the start of Egyptian culture. Joan Gardner handled virtually every one of the ancient things in this exhibit and has a special reverence for them.
You develop a real admiration for the ancient artisans because you see how very good they were. It's kind of mind-boggling. On some objects we feel we have the imprint of an ancient hand, and those kinds of things really make it real.
Amulets were thought to embody the spirits of gods and goddesses and were used to ward off disaster, particularly during the passage to the afterlife. The wedged eye represented the left eye of the falcon-headed god Horus and was a potent protective symbol. These beetle-shaped charms, or scarabs, symbolized rebirth. And these little sons of Horus were sewn into a mummy's wrappings to guard the body of the deceased. To the Egyptians, a model was just as useful as the real thing to a person in the afterlife. So, scaled-down models of stone vessels were placed in tombs. There were even models of food, like these strange clay pieces of rolled beef. But perhaps the most ingenious models were little figurines called shabtis.
The interesting Egyptians came up with the idea that if they placed these little figurines in the tomb with the deceased, that when the deities called on the deceased to come and perform his work, that in fact the deceased could turn to the little figurine and that person would physically go out and hoe the field or make the pottery or do the writing or whatever particular duties were being requested by the deities. That really says a lot about the ancient Egyptians really were preparing for the afterlife very thoroughly.
With such wonderful artifacts inside the hall, the Carnegie wanted a grand statement outside to draw attention. The ancient Egyptians placed monumental statues at the entrances to their temples. So the Carnegie thought a similar statement would be fitting for the entrance to Walton Hall. Sculptor Pat Martin traveled to Egypt with the Carnegie's research team to get a feel for how ancient artists did their work.
They were real artists. You're talking 3,000 years ago, and with limited tools, working in massive blocks of stone. It's just amazing what they could do.
Pat fashioned his statue faces first from clay. Then he cast them in plaster. He also created plaster models of the bodies. When assembled with their heads on, Pat's 10-foot-tall statues had those unusual proportions that give ancient Egyptian figures their unique style.
The high waist, often the shoulders were a lot broader. The legs were more massive, particularly in colossal statues. The fingers were elongated. You know, little details like this that you have to, forget about what you know and go about what they did.
Finally, both colossal figures were entirely covered with latex to make a mold. From the molds, the final statues were cast out of fiberglass.
So although these things are 10 feet tall and they look extremely impressive when one views them, each of them actually weighs about 50 pounds because they're made out of fiberglass.
To finish the figures, Pat painted them in colors that look very bold and modern, but in fact are close to the colors ancient Egyptians were using in roughly 1275 BC.
To a Westerner looking at the statues today, the colors look almost vibrant. They really strike you when you look at them.
The ancient Egyptians certainly planned for an afterlife, though they might be surprised that their physical remains and belongings have found their afterlife in a museum. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen prepared elaborate places to house the body and the possessions of the deceased. Here, modern craftsmen have replicated an ancient tomb. This is as close as most of us will ever get to entering an intact Egyptian burial chamber.
In ancient Egypt, some tombs were brightly painted with scenes from daily life, as well as religious scenes and pictures representing the ideals of the next world. To make its tomb accurate, the Carnegie sent a team to photograph a real burial chamber in Egypt. The photographs were projected and traced onto an alcove in the Egypt Hall. Artist Lynn Holden and his wife Susan were brought in to duplicate this tomb, which belonged to Sennacherib, a middle-class craftsman who lived during Dynasty 19, 3,300 years ago.
People often ask me about the curse. Aren't you afraid of the curse? Or aren't you doing something that's against the ancient Egyptians' intentions for these materials? Not at all. We're doing exactly what they wanted. We're preserving their materials forever, making them known to others so that they'll be remembered, known, and thought of well.
Lynn uses modern paints that are close to those that the ancients used. There is a simple economic reason why Egyptian paintings had more red and yellow than green or blue in them.
The boldest colors, the red and yellow, are both iron oxides. Those are the most predominant, they had the most, and they were the least expensive. Greens and blues were much more expensive and from more unusual sources. Green was originally ground malachite, a very expensive material, and then later on they used a greenish version of copper salts.
When a figure had green flesh, it symbolized death and rebirth to the ancient Egyptians.
For instance, The one here is the god Osiris. He is the god of the underworld, and very important because it is before Osiris that your soul is judged. On the same wall, you can see Senedjem's mummy lying on a funeral bier, or a type of bed, with Anubis bending over him. Anubis is the jackal-headed god of embalmment and the protector of the cemetery area. It is Anubis who is in charge of seeing that the body is mummified correctly. And in actuality, while the body was being mummified, a priest wearing a jackal-headed mask performed these rites, or supervised those rites.
The objects inside this tomb did not belong to Senedjem, but they come from roughly the same historical period and are typical of things middle-class Egyptians would have placed in a tomb. The coffin, of course, protected the mummified body, while canopic jars held the deceased's internal organs. The Carnegie's tomb, with its hieroglyphic painting and its funerary equipment, is remarkably realistic.
It'll take your breath away when you walk into that thing. It's just awesome. And yet it's so very, very still. You get that same feeling of quiet, just like the ones were in the tomb.
The entire exhibit evokes the spirit of the ancient Egyptian people, but not in a mystical or fantastic way. Instead, it brings us closer to the truth about how people lived and died in one of the greatest cultures known to man.
From the Nile River to the Three Rivers of Pittsburgh has been a long journey for these pieces of ancient Egypt. The truth about these objects can be more exciting than the strangest myths. Ancient Egypt had a remarkable civilization. With care and modern museum techniques, these symbols of that great culture will endure, so that our children and their children and generations to come will be able to marvel at the world of ancient Egypt.